What if the craziest myths you've ever heard were just badly labeled facts? Ancient cities no one believed in? Found? Death rays? Possible. Real unicorns? Kinda. Today, we're going through 33 historical lies that turned out to be disturbingly real. This isn't mythology. It's history with a plot twist. 1. The unicorn was real, but it was a giant hairy rhino. So you know the majestic, sparkly unicorn from fairy tales? Well, history's version was less magical rainbow pony and more furry one-horned tank. Meet the Elasmotherium sibericum, the Siberian unicorn. This thing was a massive, hairy rhinoceros that roamed Eurasia and could weigh up to 4 tons, with a single, colossal horn smack in the middle of its forehead. Forget graceful prancing through enchanted forests. This beast was a prehistoric bulldozer. For centuries, tales of a one-horned creature were dismissed as pure fantasy, but paleontologists eventually found the fossils to prove it. So, yes, unicorns were real. They just weren't the elegant creatures you'd want on a t-shirt, unless that t-shirt says, "I survived an encounter with a fuzzy, multi-ton battering ram." 2. The poison damsels of India were real human weapons. The legend of the Vishakanya, or poison damsels, sounds like something straight out of a James Bond movie, but with more ancient espionage. The story goes that beautiful young women in ancient India were raised from birth on a carefully curated diet of poison and venom. Over time, they would build up an immunity, but their own bodily fluids would become lethal to others. A single kiss, or even just intimate contact, could be a death sentence. For a long time, this was considered pure folklore, a cautionary tale about femme fatales. However, historical texts from the Mauryan Empire confirm that this was a very real and terrifyingly effective method of assassination. It's the ultimate form of look, but don't touch, taking the concept of a toxic relationship to a whole new, literal level. 3. The real-life kraken was a giant squid. The kraken, a legendary sea monster so massive it could pull entire ships down to the depths with its colossal tentacles. For sailors, it was the ultimate nightmare, a myth whispered in terrified tones across the 7 seas. For everyone else, it was just a cool story. Well, it turns out the sailors weren't just drunk. While it might not have been a single island-sized beast, the legend was almost certainly inspired by very real and very giant squids. These creatures can grow to be over 40 feet long, with eyes the size of dinner plates and tentacles strong enough to cause serious trouble for a wooden ship. Imagine being a 17th century sailor and seeing one of those things emerge from the murky depths. You wouldn't just tell stories, you'd probably need a change of pants and a new career. 4. Stone Age brain surgery with survival rates. If you think modern medicine is stressful, imagine getting brain surgery during the Stone Age. The procedure was called trepanation, and it involved drilling, cutting, or scraping a hole into the human skull. And no, this wasn't just some gruesome post-mortem ritual. Archaeologists have found numerous prehistoric skulls with these holes that show clear signs of healing and bone regrowth, meaning the patients actually survived for years after the operation. Why did they do it? Theories range from treating head injuries and epilepsy to releasing evil spirits. Whatever the reason, the fact that our cave-dwelling ancestors were performing brain surgery with flint tools and that people were surviving it is both terrifying and mind-bogglingly impressive. Talk about a headache. 5. Women fought and died as gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. The image of a gladiator is almost always a muscle-bound dude with a sword and a grimace. But for a long time, whispers of female gladiators, or gladiatrices, were dismissed by many historians as pure fantasy or misinterpretation. That was until archaeology stepped in. In 2000, a grave was discovered in London containing the remains of a woman buried with the full, expensive honors of a gladiator, including pottery depicting combat scenes. Roman art and inscriptions also backed it up, describing women fighting with swords, shields, and helmets, often against each other or even exotic beasts. They weren't just a sideshow, They were trained fighters. So the next time you watch a movie about the Colosseum, remember, it wasn't just a boys' club. Women were in the arena, spilling blood for the roaring crowds too. 6. The real Moby Dick was a vengeful white whale named Mocha Dick. Herman Melville's Moby Dick wasn't just a random story he cooked up about an angry whale. It was based on a very real, very famous, and very dangerous albino sperm whale named Mocha Dick. This whale was a legend among 19th century whalers in the Pacific. He was known for his incredible size, his distinctive white coloring, and most importantly, his extreme aggression towards whaling ships. Unlike other whales that would flee, Mocha Dick would actively attack boats, reportedly surviving encounters with dozens of harpoons. He was the ultimate maritime menace, the bane of the whaling industry, before he was finally killed. So, the epic tale of Captain Ahab's obsessive hunt wasn't fiction. It was inspired by a real-life sea monster who decided that mankind was the one that needed to be hunted. 7. Emperor Caligula's giant, floating pleasure palaces. Roman Emperor Caligula is famous for being, to put it mildly, completely unhinged. He tried to make his horse a consul, for crying out loud. But one of his most outlandish legends was that he built 2 massive floating pleasure palaces on Lake Nemi. These were said to be gigantic barges decorated with marble, mosaics, and lead piping for hot and cold running water. Basically, floating luxury villas for his infamous parties. For nearly 2,000 years, everyone thought this was just another tall tale about his insanity. Then, in the 1920s, the lake was partially drained, and there they were. The remains of 2 colossal ships, far larger and more technologically advanced than anyone believed possible for that era. They were genuine floating monuments to imperial excess. Caligula wasn't just crazy, he was crazy with an engineering budget. 8. The London Necropolis Railway, a real-life ghost train. A train dedicated solely to transporting dead people and their mourners sounds like something from a gothic horror story. But for nearly a century, the London Necropolis Railway was a very real and very busy part of London's infrastructure. In the mid-19th century, London's cemeteries were literally overflowing, creating a serious public health crisis. The solution? A dedicated railway line with its own private station in Waterloo, designed to ferry coffins and grieving families out to the massive Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. There were first, second, and third-class tickets available for both the living and the deceased, ensuring you could travel to your final resting place in a style befitting your station in life. It was a practical, if slightly morbid, solution to a deadly problem. A real-life ghost train, running on a daily schedule. 9. The real-life Pied Piper of Hamelin Incident. We all know the fairy tale. A magical piper lures rats out of a town, the ungrateful mayor refuses to pay, and the piper takes revenge by luring away all the children. It's a creepy story for kids, but surely just a story, right? Well, something incredibly strange and terrifying did happen in the German town of Hamelin in the year 1284. The town's own chronicles, dating back to the 14th century, state that on June 26th, a piper led 130 children out of the town, and they vanished into a mountain, never to be seen again. While the magical pipe is probably folklore, the mass disappearance of the town's youth is a real historical event. Theories range from the children dying in a plague epidemic to being sold or recruited for a disastrous crusade. The truth is, nobody knows for sure what happened to them. The myth isn't the disappearance, the myth is the happy ending that never existed. 10. Mount Everest was covered in marine fossils. Here's a question that sounds like a riddle. Where can you find ancient sea creatures? At the bottom of the ocean, right? Wrong. You can also find them at the very top of the world. For years, one of the most mind-bending geological facts was dismissed by many as impossible. The summit of Mount Everest is made of marine limestone and is packed with the fossilized remains of ocean life. It sounds completely absurd until you remember the immense power of plate tectonics. The rock that forms the highest peaks of the Himalayas was once the floor of an ancient ocean. Over tens of millions of years, the Indian subcontinent crashed into Asia with such force that it pushed that seafloor nearly 30,000 feet into the sky. So yes, you can literally stand on the roof of the world and find the fossil of a creature that once lived miles beneath the waves. 11. The existence of gorillas was considered a myth for centuries. Imagine trying to describe a gorilla to someone who has never seen or heard of one. A giant, hairy, super strong wild man that lives in the jungle and pounds its chest. It's not surprising that for over 2,000 years, Western civilization treated tales of these creatures as pure myth. The Carthaginian explorer Hanno the Navigator wrote about a tribe of savage people covered in hair called gorillae back in the 5th century BC, but his account was dismissed as fantasy. For centuries, stories of these monsters were lumped in with legends of dragons and griffins. It wasn't until the 1840s that Western scientists finally obtained a skull and then a full specimen, confirming that the mythical hairy wild men of Africa were very, very real. The planet's largest primate was basically Bigfoot for most of human history. 12. Archimedes' death ray was scientifically plausible. The story of Archimedes using a death ray to defend his city of Syracuse sounds like something from a comic book. The legend claims the Greek genius used a series of mirrors to focus sunlight onto invading Roman ships, setting them ablaze from a distance. For centuries, this was considered pure propaganda, a cool story to make a historical figure seem even more brilliant. But is it possible? While there's no definitive proof Archimedes actually built it, modern science says, maybe. Experiments, including some by the show Mythbusters and a more successful test by students at MIT, have demonstrated that under the right conditions, concentrated sunlight from polished bronze mirrors can indeed ignite wood. So while we don't know if it actually happened, the myth of the death ray was based on sound physics. It wasn't magic. It was science, way ahead of its time. 13. The terrifying Amazon warrior. Women were real. The Amazons of Greek mythology are legendary, a fierce nation of all-female warriors who were the equals of any male hero. They were often portrayed as man-hating archers who would remove a breast to better draw a bowstring. For a long time, historians assumed they were just a Greek fantasy, a way to explore ideas about gender and civilization. But then they started digging. Archaeologists excavating Scythian burial mounds in the steppes of Eurasia found something that changed everything: the graves of women buried with bows, arrows, swords, and daggers. Many of the skeletons even showed signs of battle wounds. These were real-life warrior women from the exact region the Greeks described. They might not have been a nation of only women, but the Scythians were a culture where women rode into battle and fought fiercely right alongside their men. 14. The sea serpent was a real, bizarre-looking fish. For as long as humans have sailed the oceans, they've told stories of giant, snake-like sea serpents. These monstrous creatures were the stuff of nightmares, appearing on maps as a warning and in legends as a terrifying foe. Obviously, just the product of overactive imaginations and too much rum, right? Well, many of these sightings can likely be chalked up to a very real and very weird fish, the oarfish. As the world's longest bony fish, it can grow to over 30 feet long. It's silvery, ribbon-shaped, and has a bright red dorsal fin that runs the length of its body, looking like a fiery mane. When oarfish are sick or dying, they come to the surface, where their strange, undulating movement makes them look exactly like a mythical sea serpent. They're the perfect explanation for the legend, a real-life monster that's almost as strange as the myth itself. 15. The existence of pygmies was known to ancient Egyptians. To later European explorers and writers, stories of a race of very small people living deep in the heart of Africa sounded like pure folklore, belonging in the same category as dwarves and fairies. It was a myth, a fairy tale passed down through generations. Except the ancient Egyptians knew they were real over 4,000 years ago. One of the most famous historical documents confirming this is a letter from a young pharaoh Pepi Tseku, written around 2270 BC. He enthusiastically instructs his expedition leader to take great care of a dancing dwarf being brought back from Central Africa, promising a great reward. The Egyptians held pygmy people in high regard, often as divine dancers, and actively traded with them. So, what Europeans dismissed as a myth for centuries was, to the ancient Egyptians, a well-documented and celebrated reality. 16. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek computer. If you told someone that the ancient Greeks had a computer, they would probably laugh at you. The popular image of ancient technology is one of simple tools and brute force. The idea of intricate, geared machinery belongs to a much later era. This was the mainstream view until a corroded lump of bronze was recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. For decades, its secrets were locked away by corrosion, but modern X-rays and CT scans revealed a stunning truth. Inside was a complex system of over 30 interlocking bronze gears, a device of breathtaking sophistication. It was an analog computer designed to predict the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, track eclipses, and even signal the next Olympic Games. It was a piece of technology so advanced that nothing comparable would be seen again for over 1,000 years. 17. The assassins, Hashashin, were a real order of political killers. The word assassin conjures images from video games, hooded figures performing impossible stealth kills. For centuries, the story of the Hashashin was just that, a legend of a secretive cult of killers in the medieval Middle East, supposedly fueled by hashish and promises of paradise. Marco Polo's accounts made them sound like a fanatical drug cartel. But the core of the myth is terrifyingly real. They were the Nizari Ismailis, a Shia sect operating from impregnable mountain fortresses like Alamut. They didn't use large armies. They perfected psychological warfare through targeted political assassination. Their highly trained agents, known as fidei, would eliminate caliphs, viziers, and crusader leaders in public, often at the cost of their own lives. The hashish part was likely enemy propaganda, which makes them even scarier. They weren't high. They were disciplined, sober, and ruthlessly effective. 18. The Nazca lines were made by removing rocks, not aliens. Giant drawings of hummingbirds, spiders, and mysterious figures etched into the desert floor, so enormous they can only be properly seen from the sky. For decades, the most popular explanation wasn't ancient ingenuity. It was, of course, aliens. The show Ancient Aliens has practically built its brand on this myth. But the truth is far more human and, in its own way, more impressive. The Nazca civilization created these massive geoglyphs with a stunningly simple technique. They just removed the reddish-brown, iron oxide-coated pebbles from the desert surface to reveal the lighter-colored ground underneath. It's large-scale landscaping. The real mystery isn't how they did it, but why. Were they for astronomical purposes, religious ceremonies, or just the world's largest art installation? We still don't know, but we do know it didn't require a UFO. 19. The sinking of Atlantis was probably the eruption of Thera, Atlantis. The legendary island continent with an advanced civilization that vanished beneath the waves in a single day. It's the ultimate myth of a lost paradise. But Plato's story might not have been pure fantasy. It was likely a distorted memory of a very real and very catastrophic historical event, the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BC. This was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, an explosion that literally blew the center of the island apart and triggered colossal tsunamis across the Mediterranean. This cataclysm effectively wiped out the advanced Minoan civilization based on nearby Crete. An advanced island culture destroyed by the sea in a cataclysmic event? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Atlantis wasn't a lost continent, but a real Bronze Age superpower erased by the fury of nature. 20. The Oracle Bones of China confirmed a mythical dynasty. For a long time, the Shang dynasty, one of China's earliest recorded dynasties, was considered a myth by many scholars. It existed only in ancient texts written centuries later, much like King Arthur of Britain. There was no archaeological proof. That is, until Chinese pharmacists started selling dragon bones for medicinal purposes in the late 1800s. A curious scholar noticed strange carvings on these bones, which turned out to be the earliest known form of Chinese writing. The dragon bones were actually turtle shells and ox shoulder blades used by the Shang kings for divination over 3,000 years ago. The inscriptions on them recorded royal lineages and events, perfectly matching the mythical histories. An entire dynasty was proven real because of artifacts being ground up for medicine. 21. Homer's epic fantasy. City of Troy was a real brutal place. The Trojan War, with its epic heroes like Achilles and Hector, and the ingenious Trojan horse, was the blockbuster story of the ancient world. But for thousands of years, the city of Troy itself was believed to be as fictional as the gods who supposedly took part in the battle. That was until a wealthy German businessman and amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, who was obsessed with Homer's epics, decided to take the stories literally. In the 1870s, he started digging at a mound in modern Turkey and found it. Not just one city, but multiple layers of cities. And one of those layers, now known as Troy Asevana, showed undeniable evidence of being destroyed in a brutal war around the exact time the Trojan War was supposed to have happened. The giant wooden horse might be a poetic invention, but the city and its violent end were very, very real. 22. The Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. Song of Roland. The Song of Roland is one of the world's most famous epic poems, telling the heroic tale of Charlemagne's knight Roland, who makes a valiant last stand against a massive army of 400,000 Saracens in the Pyrenees. It's a cornerstone of French literature, a story of Christian heroism against overwhelming odds. But the real story is much less glamorous and way more embarrassing for Charlemagne. A battle did happen at Roncesvalles Pass in 778, and Charlemagne's rearguard was indeed wiped out. But the attackers weren't a huge Muslim army. They were local Christian Basques, who were furious because Charlemagne's army had just sacked their capital city on its way through Spain. The epic poem took a humiliating defeat at the hands of angry locals and spun it into a grand tale of religious warfare. It's one of history's greatest PR jobs. 23. The secret chambers in the Great Pyramid are real. For centuries, the Great Pyramid of Giza has been surrounded by myths of hidden passages, secret chambers, and lost knowledge. While many of these ideas came from treasure hunters and mystics, the idea that we had found everything there was to find became mainstream. The pyramid was just a solid mass of stone, with a few known corridors. Well, it turns out the mystics were onto something. In 2017, using a cutting-edge technology called muon tomography, which uses cosmic rays to scan structures, scientists made a stunning announcement. They had discovered a massive, previously unknown void deep inside the pyramid, at least 100 feet long, located right above the Grand Gallery. This big void proved that after 4,500 years of study, one of the most famous structures on Earth still holds giant secrets. 24. The biblical cataclysm of Sodom and Gomorrah was likely a meteor explosion. The story is iconic. Two cities so full of sin that God destroys them with a rain of fire and brimstone. For most, it's a powerful religious metaphor. But what if it's the memory of a real, physical event? Archaeologists excavating a site called Tal el Hammam in Jordan have uncovered evidence of a thriving Bronze Age city that was instantly obliterated around 3,600 years ago. The evidence points not to an earthquake or a volcano, but a cataclysmic cosmic airburst, likely from a meteor exploding in the atmosphere with the force of thousands of atomic bombs. The blast would have vaporized the city, melted pottery into glass, and boiled the Jordan River. It's a perfect scientific explanation for a biblical account of fiery destruction from the sky, suggesting the story wasn't a fable, but a traumatized eyewitness account of a genuine apocalypse. 25. The Wandering City of Vinland, Viking Settlement in America. The Viking sagas are epic tales of exploration and conquest, but for centuries, their stories of a green, fertile land called Vinland far to the west of Greenland, were dismissed as boastful folklore. The idea that Vikings had reached North America almost 500 years before Columbus was just too far-fetched for most historians. It was a national myth for Scandinavians, but not credible history. Then, in the 1960s, a pair of Norwegian explorers, Helge and Anstein Ingstad, followed the clues in the sagas and made a discovery that rewrote the history books. At a place called L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, they uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement. They found turf-walled longhouses and iron-working artifacts that were unmistakably Viking. The myth of Vinland was true. The Vikings had been here, built homes, and then left, leaving behind only a legend that waited 1,000 years to be proven. 26. The Scythian Gold. Treasures described by Herodotus were real. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus was known as both the father of history and the father of lies, because his writings were filled with incredible tales of far-off lands. He wrote extensively about the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the steppes, and their barbaric custom of burying their kings with vast quantities of elaborate gold treasures and sacrifice servants. It sounded wildly exaggerated, a classic case of a civilized Greek describing barbarians in the most sensational way possible. But in the 20th century, archaeologists began excavating Scythian burial mounds, or kurgans, across Ukraine and southern Russia. What they found was breathtaking and proved Herodotus wasn't lying. The tombs were filled with staggering amounts of exquisitely crafted gold objects, combs, jewelry, armor, and vessels, often depicting scenes of Scythian life, exactly as he had described. 27. The Lost Roman Legion that ended up in China. This one still feels like a Hollywood movie script. The story goes that after the disastrous Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the Parthians crushed a Roman army, a legion of several thousand Roman soldiers wasn't wiped out but was instead captured and forced to march east. They eventually served as mercenary soldiers on the Parthian frontier, fought the Chinese, were captured again, and finally settled in a village on the edge of the Gobi Desert called Lykian. For a long time, this was pure speculation, a tantalizing what-if of history. But the evidence is surprisingly compelling. Chinese records from the period mention capturing soldiers who used a fish-scale formation, a perfect description of the Roman testudo. Furthermore, recent DNA tests on the villagers of Lykian have revealed a high percentage of Caucasian ancestry. The Lost Legion may have truly marched its way right off the Western map and into Chinese history.